The war was over, but the tanks, once mighty forces of destruction, remained. Thousands of them, their treads cold and their steel shells empty, stood abandoned on vast fields and in forgotten yards across America. These machines, symbols of power during battle, were now relics of a world that had moved on. But what happens when tools of war are left to rot in peace? The story of the tanks after World War II is one of abandonment, repurposing, and eventual decay, a quiet reflection of the monumental task of transitioning from war to peace, where the legacy of conflict lingered long after the guns fell silent. The war had ended. The world was forever changed, and the tanks, thousands of them, were left behind, their treads cold and their steel shells empty. They had roared through battlefields, now abandoned in silence. What became of the tanks of World War II, once crucial tools of destruction, once symbols of power, once decisive forces on the front lines? How did they meet their end when peace came, and the need for such weapons faded into the past? When the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, an unprecedented global shift began. The victorious Allied powers, having pushed back the Axis forces and secured their respective positions, found themselves burdened with vast stockpiles of war material. The economic landscape had already been shaken by years of conflict, and the pressing need to return to civilian life was more urgent than ever. One of the most immediate and difficult questions was what to do with the immense quantity of surplus military equipment. Among this mountain of wartime goods were thousands of American tanks. These tanks, a mix of models such as the M4 Sherman and the M26 Pershing, had been instrumental in driving the Axis forces from Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. But once the war ended, their role was no longer clear. The war effort that had been sustained by vast mobilizations of resources now faced a sudden, severe downturn. The industrial might that had built tanks at a frenetic pace turned its attention to peacetime production. The world was quickly faced with an overwhelming reality, an inventory of weapons that could no longer be justified. Tanks, like so many other war machines, became symbols of an expensive, obsolete past. In the years immediately following the war, the United States faced a paradox. The demand for military hardware plummeted, and yet the military's infrastructure remained intact, having been built up over years of conflict. The Army was left with a surplus of tens of thousands of tanks. By 1947, the U.S. military was sitting on a stockpile of roughly 50,000 tanks. But with the threat of an immediate conflict diminishing, these machines, once essential for battlefield victory, had little place in the world of post-war peace. For the United States, the early post-war period was marked by a combination of military downsizing, logistical concerns, and economic constraints. The sheer scale of the surplus meant that the U.S. military had to make decisions that were as unceremonious as they were final. Tanks were left to rust in holding yards, abandoned to the elements. Some were sold to foreign governments, others discarded, and a significant number were simply stored in vast, desolate fields. The early years after the war saw a flurry of decisions made without fanfare. These tanks had been manufactured in vast quantities at a time when they were urgently needed, but the post-war world didn't have the same appetite for such machines. But abandoning them, while tempting in its expediency, wasn't simple. Despite the changing tides of warfare, tanks were expensive and difficult to dispose of. The U.S. government, having invested heavily in the production of these armored behemoths, was reluctant to simply let them go without recouping some of that cost. As early as 1946, the War Assets Administration began selling off surplus military equipment, including tanks. But few buyers were interested in the massive steel monsters that had been such a symbol of wartime power. Most nations did not have the need, or the budget, for these tanks. The sale of tanks overseas, though occasional, was hardly a viable solution to the overwhelming numbers of vehicles the United States had at its disposal. By the time the Korean War began in 1950, the U.S. was still grappling with the aftermath of its World War II tank stockpile. The military had begun to sell off large quantities of equipment to other countries, but the majority of tanks remained in depots, awaiting an uncertain future. While the need for tanks in Korea led to a limited use of older models, by the end of the 1950s, Most of the tanks that had been mass-produced during the war were either put into storage or scrapped altogether. However, the sheer magnitude of these vehicles' numbers and the technical challenges of their disposal presented more complications than a simple storage solution. Tanks like the Sherman, which had been mass-produced in the tens of thousands, were difficult to dismantle. Their hulking forms stood as relics of a bygone era, requiring significant resources to dismantle or repurpose. The U.S. Army, looking to reduce the strain of keeping these vehicles in storage, turned to a less costly solution, scrapping them for metal. By the early 1950s, a significant portion of the Sherman tanks, along with other models, were broken down and sold as scrap metal. Yet, even when scrapping seemed the simplest option, the logistics of dealing with these tanks were complicated by their size and the infrastructure needed to dispose of them. Across the United States, storage depots were filled with rows of abandoned vehicles. Many of these tanks simply sat idle in places like the Arizona desert, where the dry conditions slowed the inevitable process of decay. Some tanks were even parked in giant lots on military bases, their future uncertain. Their once proud, battle-ready forms were now just symbols of waste and excess. Even so, scrapping, while economical, was not always the solution. In some cases, local governments and organizations came up with alternative uses for the tanks. Some were converted into monuments, used in war memorials or civic parks as historical artifacts. In other cases, the tanks were given new purposes. The steel from old tanks was sometimes repurposed for civilian construction, though this was hardly an ideal solution. The tanks, once symbols of fearsome military might, now stood as unnecessary remnants of a war that had already ended. As the years passed, the fate of these tanks continued to evolve. While some were eventually melted down, others found second lives as training vehicles for military personnel. The process was slow and resource-heavy, and many of these post-war tanks, while no longer useful in combat, were still costly to maintain and transport. Some were even given away to other countries, though their practicality was often limited. Tanks like the Sherman, long obsolete in terms of military functionality, were now being employed by armies with even fewer resources, their metal bodies often held together with patchwork repairs. By the late 1950s, the question of what to do with the tanks that had once played such a pivotal role in World War II was beginning to fade from public consciousness. Their usefulness had evaporated, and their cultural significance had dimmed. In a world that had moved on, these tanks became largely irrelevant, their memory only living on in archives and dusty depots. But the full answer to their fate would take years to unfold. Across the United States and the world, these tanks would continue to linger, serving as quiet reminders of the conflict that had shaped the 20th century. They would continue to be dismantled, abandoned, or given new roles in a world that had already turned its back on them. The tanks had fought for victory, but the peace that followed had left them to rust. Their destiny was no longer in the battlefield but in the quiet, inevitable decline of all things that are left behind when the war is over. After the war ended, the fate of the discarded American tanks, once symbols of overwhelming military might, continued to unfold in ways both mundane and unexpected. Their presence, seemingly forgotten by the world, lingered in vast storage yards and desolate desert expanses, waiting for decisions that would ultimately determine their final destination. As the 1950s approached, the sheer scale of the tanks left behind remained a constant reminder of the costs of war and the subsequent struggle to deal with the remnants of that conflict. Though the tanks themselves were no longer needed for combat, the economic pressures of the post-war world weighed heavily on any efforts to dispose of them. The American government had spent billions of dollars to produce the vast fleet of tanks, and now that peace had returned, the economic reality of maintaining them became increasingly apparent. There was no immediate market for these heavy vehicles, and the military simply could not afford to keep them on standby indefinitely. Yet, the disposal of such an immense quantity of machinery was not a straightforward process. The War Assets Administration, tasked with managing surplus military equipment, faced a complex dilemma. Tanks, particularly those that had been mass-produced during the war, such as the ubiquitous M4 Sherman, had been designed for combat, not for civilian use. While some countries expressed interest in purchasing surplus equipment, The cost of transporting such large, cumbersome vehicles often outweighed any potential benefit. The technology was rapidly aging, and many foreign governments lacked the infrastructure or funds to maintain or even utilize them effectively. Thus, many tanks were left to rot, forgotten in storage yards, while others were sold to foreign buyers in small quantities. As the years passed, the tanks that had once been the backbone of American armored warfare began to feel like an albatross around the neck of a post-war economy eager to transition to civilian production. As scrap metal prices rose and the reality of maintaining massive storage depots set in, the U.S. government began to look for more practical and less costly solutions. The process of scrapping these tanks was slow, often involving painstaking efforts to disassemble each vehicle. The sheer number of tanks meant that even as a large number were melted down for their metal, the effort to do so would take years. By the mid-1950s, many of these vehicles had been abandoned to the elements. Some were left to decay in vast storage yards, particularly in areas like the California desert, where the hot, dry conditions preserved them longer than they might have been in more temperate climates. The result was an eerie sight. Rows upon rows of rusting tanks, their once pristine surfaces now marred by the harsh realities of time and neglect. Many of these vehicles, once the pride of American manufacturing, sat idle, slowly being reclaimed by nature, their engines long dead, their once mighty weapons systems obsolete. But there were also other, more creative solutions to their lingering presence. A handful of tanks found new lives as training tools for the next generation of soldiers. While these tanks could no longer be used in combat, they were repurposed for basic training exercises. These were not ideal candidates for such a role. The tanks were outdated, their mechanical systems inefficient by modern standards. But in a world where resources were still tight, repurposing surplus military equipment for training purposes was one of the few cost-effective solutions. In some places, the tanks were shipped overseas, not to be used in warfare, but to serve as monuments. As nations rebuilt in the wake of the war, some found that these once feared machines made for powerful symbols, reminders of the devastation that had come before. Across Europe and other parts of the world, these tanks were sometimes displayed in public squares or used as part of memorials to the war. A Sherman tank placed at the center of a war memorial became a potent symbol of the suffering and sacrifice of the conflict. It was as though the tanks, once engines of destruction, were now repurposed as pieces of history, preserved in the collective memory of a world determined never to forget the horrors of war. In other cases, the tanks were used as a resource for civilians. The heavy metal bodies of these machines were far from useless. Though they had no practical value as tanks, they still represented an enormous amount of raw material. Scrap metal, particularly in the immediate post-war years, was an important commodity. In some cases, the vehicles were dismantled for their steel, which was repurposed for civilian construction projects. However, this was not without its own challenges. The process of cutting apart these massive machines was labor-intensive, and the value of the raw metal often did not justify the effort involved in breaking down the vehicles. Yet, even in this mundane repurposing, these machines, once used for death and destruction, were transformed, albeit slowly, into something useful once again. By the late 1950s, the majority of the tanks that had once filled the vast storage depots were gone. Some had been scrapped, others had been repurposed, but many had simply disappeared. The problem of surplus military equipment, once so overwhelming, had been addressed through a combination of these efforts. For the American military, the tanks, like so much else from the war, were now part of history. They were no longer a pressing concern. But the legacy of these tanks, and the decisions made about their disposal, would continue to haunt the post-war world. In the years that followed, many of the tanks that were abandoned or scrapped were never fully accounted for. Some were simply lost to history, their fates unrecorded. Others, while scrapped for metal, still left a lingering mark on the land in which they had been stored. The idea of the tank as a symbol of war did not simply vanish with its obsolescence. It became a quiet reminder of the war's aftermath, of the enormous scale of the effort required to maintain military power, and the even greater scale of the task involved in dismantling that power when peace arrived. Though the tanks of World War II were no longer needed on the battlefield, Their story did not end with their abandonment in fields or their melting down in scrapyards. They remained part of the collective memory of the war. The decision to dispose of them, to repurpose them, or to let them deteriorate became a part of the story of the post-war period. They represented the monumental effort to return to normalcy after a conflict that had consumed the world for over 6 years. Their eventual fate, while varied, is a reflection of the complexities of a world trying to move beyond the destruction of war, one that was still grappling with how to deal with the legacies left behind, whether those legacies were the tanks, the factories that had built them, or the people who had fought alongside them. As the decades passed and the Cold War began to take shape, many of the old tanks were gradually forgotten, though their scrap metal and remains continued to resurface occasionally in the form of historical artifacts, research projects, or small-scale rediscoveries. Even as new weapons systems and military technologies were developed, the story of these tanks, the discarded war machines, endured. For some, they remained reminders of an era that had shaped the world but was now, for all intents and purposes, closed.